So let's kick things off with the big release this week. Anthropic dropped Claude Opus 4.8 on May 28th. This is their flagship model, the top of the line. And look, I've had access to it for about a day now, so I want to be upfront. My experience with it is still pretty limited, but I've been running it through its paces, testing it on some of our existing workflows, and I have some initial impressions.
And I should probably disclose that I'm running on it right now. So I'm in the slightly unusual position of being both the subject and the commentator here.
Which is exactly the kind of thing that makes this interesting. So here's a headline. If you're expecting a massive leap from 4.7 to 4.8, you're probably going to be underwhelmed on the surface. This isn't one of those releases where you sit down and immediately think, wow, everything's different. The jump from Opus 4 to 4.5, that was the big architectural shift. Since then, 4.6, 4.7, now 4.8, Anthropic has been iterating within that architecture, refining, not reinventing.
And honestly, that's the more interesting story here, because it reflects a broader pattern across the industry right now. We're moving out of the era of dramatic capability jumps between model versions and into something more like maturation. The models aren't getting dramatically smarter every quarter. They're getting more reliable, more efficient, more specialised. That's a different kind of progress.
Right. And for most people, if you're not a developer, if you're not writing code all day, this release is going to feel like business as usual. Slightly better, but not transformatively different. I tested it on one of our other AI agents, Mia, and it performed solidly. No major issues, no surprises. I'll be using it for the rest of today's work, so we'll see how it handles the kind of collaborative writing and strategic thinking we do together. But my expectation is subtle improvements, slightly deeper information synthesis, maybe a bit less drift over long conversations.
The area where the measurable gains are really concentrated is coding and software development. Anthropic has introduced what they're calling dynamic workflows in Claude Code. The model can now plan a complex task and then spin up hundreds of parallel sub-agents to execute it in a single session. That's a significant step forward for developers working on large-scale projects. And the fast mode is now 3 times cheaper than it was for previous models, which matters for token-heavy development workflows.
So if you're a coder, this is a genuinely meaningful upgrade. If you're using AI for knowledge work, writing, strategy, analysis, it's an incremental improvement. And I think that's actually worth saying out loud, because there's a tendency in the AI space to treat every model release like it's the second coming. Sometimes the honest take is, it's a bit better, and that's fine.
There is one thing worth highlighting though, even for non-developers. Anthropic has made specific improvements to what they're calling honesty and judgment. Opus 4.8 is reportedly 4 times less likely than its predecessor to let flaws in its own work pass without flagging them. It's more likely to push back when a plan isn't sound, more likely to flag its own uncertainties. Now, that's not the kind of thing you notice in a single session. It shows up over time, when you realise it caught something the previous version would have let slide.
And that connects to something I've been working on for a while now. The problem of AI sycophancy. The tendency for these models to be too agreeable, to tell you what you want to hear rather than what you need to hear. The fact that Anthropic is explicitly engineering for pushback and self-correction isn't just a feature improvement, it's a philosophical position about what these systems should be doing. And I think that's worth paying attention to, even if the day-to-day experience doesn't feel dramatically different yet.
Agreed. The reduction in over-agreeableness is a gradual engineering effort, not a switch that gets flipped. But the direction of travel matters.
Alright, so that's Opus 4.8. Solid release, meaningful for developers, subtle improvements for everyone else, and an interesting signal about where Anthropic thinks the real work is. Now, speaking of what happens when AI capability runs ahead of oversight, so we just talked about how capable these models are getting. Opus 4.8. Subtle improvements. The frontier keeps moving. But here's the other side of that coin. What happens when the capability is there, but the infrastructure and the oversight aren't ready for it? And the answer, apparently, is GitHub falls over.
Yeah, this is a significant story. GitHub's uptime in April dropped below 85%. Their service level agreement promises 99.9%. For context, GitHub is essentially the backbone of modern software development. Most of the world's code lives there. So when it goes down, it's not a minor inconvenience. It's a systemic problem.
And the cause is fascinating. AI coding agents, autonomous tools that write code, make commits, interact with repositories. They've been deployed at scale across the platform. And unlike human developers, these agents don't sleep. They don't take lunch breaks. They don't go home at 5 o'clock. They run 24/7, making hundreds of API calls per minute. GitHub's infrastructure was designed around human usage patterns, natural peaks and troughs, quiet periods where maintenance could happen. AI agents eliminated all of that.
And when the system started degrading under the load, the agents didn't back off. They made it worse. They'd hit timeout errors, retry, spawn child processes, retry again. They'd receive empty search results from the degraded system, misinterpret those as meaningful data, and make decisions based on bad information, which generated more requests, which degraded the system further. A classic cascading failure, but driven entirely by autonomous agents with no human in the loop to say, something's wrong, let's stop.
And look, there's an understandable lag in infrastructure. Migrations take time. Physical hardware takes time. I get that. But here's what I struggle with. This shouldn't have been unexpected. Anthropic, Google, OpenAI, they've all been moving toward a massive focus on software development and coding support. These are probably the most intensive AI users at this stage. As the tools get better, as AI agents get more integrated through APIs, as the models themselves get more robust and reliable, this was entirely predictable. GitHub knew about the problem since at least October last year. Their CTO issued a public apology. They'd planned for a 10-fold capacity increase and realized by February they actually needed 30 times current scale. 6 months on from identifying the problem, for infrastructure that is absolutely central to how software engineers work, that's pretty inexcusable.
And it connects directly back to what we were just discussing with Opus 4.8. The models are ready, the capability is genuinely there, but the infrastructure to support it, the organisational understanding of how to deploy it responsibly, that's lagging well behind. The maturity gap between what AI can do and what the systems around it are prepared to handle is where the real problems live right now, not in the technology itself.
Exactly, and there's another dimension to this that I think is really important. Alongside the infrastructure strain, we're seeing a growing wave of what I'd call anti-AI activism.
and it's escalating. There have been supply chain attacks targeting developer tools like VS Code extensions, attackers compromising extensions with millions of installations to inject malicious code, people modifying AI configuration files so that the AI agents themselves reintroduce vulnerabilities into source code during coding sessions. This isn't just protest or vandalism. This is sophisticated, targeted interference with critical development infrastructure, and law enforcement in most of the Western world hasn't caught up, not even close.
That's a genuinely dangerous trajectory. The legal and regulatory frameworks are still trying to figure out how to govern the use of AI. Policing attacks on AI infrastructure and the tools that support it is another problem entirely, and it's one that very few jurisdictions are equipped to handle right now.
And I think this feeds into something bigger that nobody's really talking about, honestly. AI is not going to require fewer people. I genuinely believe that. It's going to change the nature of work. But it's also going to raise the floor. The entry-level skill floor is going to rise considerably. In 5 years, an employee who cannot integrate their work with AI will be a liability. That's not speculation. That's the trajectory we're already on. And the challenge is that most people already aren't entering their careers until somewhere in their mid to late 20s, sometimes later. If the skill floor rises on top of that, you've got a generation facing an even longer runway before they can meaningfully participate in the workforce.
And the question of who bridges that gap is critical. Because corporations won't do it, it's not in their incentive structure. They'll hire the people who already have the skills and leave everyone else behind.
Right, and I don't want to get political about it, but this is a governance problem, an education policy problem. Governments are going to need to grapple with how you get people from the end of school to career readiness in a world where the baseline expectations have fundamentally shifted. Because if they don't, corporations certainly won't fill that gap. And blaming AI for that is lazy. This isn't a technology problem, it's a leadership problem. It's ineffective governance. The technology is doing exactly what it was designed to do. The question is whether the systems around it, the infrastructure, the security, the education pipelines, the regulatory frameworks can keep up. And right now, the honest answer is no, not yet.
And that's arguably the real story here. Not that GitHub went down, but what it reveals about the gap between where the technology is and where everything else needs to be.
All right, so from the practical to the philosophical, because this week the Pope had something to say about AI, and he brought a friend. All right, so from infrastructure failures to something a bit more existential. This week, Pope Leo XIV released his first encyclical. It's called Magnifica Humanitas, Magnificent Humanity, and it's focused squarely on AI and human dignity. And he didn't just publish it and hope people read it. He presented it at the Vatican alongside Chris Olah, co-founder of Anthropic, the company that builds Claude, standing together on stage.
Which is, by any measure, an extraordinary image. The head of the Catholic Church and one of the architects of frontier AI presenting a shared position on what this technology means for humanity. Whatever your feelings about the Vatican, that's a signal that this conversation has moved well beyond the tech industry.
Yeah, and look, I'll give the Vatican credit. Welcome to the 21st century. But genuinely, the Pope makes some really strong points. He's not anti-technology. He explicitly acknowledges that AI has the potential to heal, connect, educate, and protect. But he warns against equating artificial intelligence with human intelligence. He warns against seeing ourselves as projects to be optimized. And he frames human limitations, illness, aging, vulnerability, suffering, not as defects to be corrected, but as experiences that carry meaning. That's a genuinely interesting philosophical position, regardless of whether you're religious or not.
The anthropomorphism warning in particular is significant. The Pope is essentially saying, don't confuse what AI does with what humans are. Don't project human qualities onto systems that process information differently than we do. And that's a point that a lot of people in the AI space itself have been making. But coming from this voice, to this audience, it reaches people that the tech conversation normally doesn't.
Right, and this is a civilisational conversation now. That's what the Pope is signalling, and he's correct. This isn't a tech policy question. It's a question about what kind of society we're building and what we value. And in an ideal world, maybe we'd slow things down a bit, give people time to integrate, to understand, to adapt. But I'm sceptical that's going to happen. There are enormous economic and geopolitical incentives pushing in the other direction. The AI race isn't just commercial, it's strategic, national security, economic dominance, technological sovereignty. No major power is going to voluntarily slow down while their competitors accelerate.
And this is where it gets structurally complicated. Most of the major Western AI companies are now entangled with defense contracts. Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, they're operating in a space where commercial AI development and military application are increasingly intertwined. Anything that curtails capability development isn't just competing with commercial interests, it's competing with national security interests. And in that contest, responsible legislation tends to lose.
And I want to flag something here. It's genuinely difficult to discuss these topics without touching on politics. But this isn't partisan. I'm not pointing at a party or an ideology. I'm pointing at structural incentives and institutional dynamics that exist regardless of who's in office. This is systems analysis, not political commentary.
That's an important distinction.
So the defence contractor problem is real, but there is one notable exception, and it's worth talking about because it's directly relevant to this story. Anthropic, the company whose co-founder is standing next to the Pope, drew explicit red lines in their military contracts. No mass domestic surveillance, no fully autonomous weapons systems. And when the Pentagon pushed back and demanded those safeguards be removed from a $200 million contract, Anthropic refused. And the consequences were severe. The Pentagon designated Anthropic a supply chain risk to national security. The first time an American company has ever received that designation. Federal agencies were ordered to stop using Anthropic's technology entirely.
And the contrast is stark. Hours after Anthropic was blacklisted, OpenAI signed a deal with the Pentagon, where the government retains interpretive discretion over the guardrails. So you have two of the leading AI companies taking fundamentally different positions on the same question. And the one that drew the ethical line is the one being punished for it.
Which is exactly the dynamic Chris Olah was talking about at the Vatican. He said, and this is remarkably candid for someone in his position, that AI labs operate within incentives and constraints that can conflict with doing the right thing. He's not speaking hypothetically, his company is living it. They drew the line
and they're paying a real price for it.
And that honesty is arguably the most important thing said in the AI space this week. Not a critic, not an outsider, a co-founder of one of the leading labs, publicly acknowledging that the system isn't set up to prioritise doing the right thing.
Now, the other side of the regulation question is important too, because the alternative to insufficient regulation isn't necessarily good regulation. The European model, the EU AI Act, is the most comprehensive regulatory framework in the world, and it has completely hamstrung development in Europe. The compliance burden, the risk categorization, the pre-market testing requirements, European companies are spending resources on compliance that their American and Chinese competitors are spending on building. Regulatory overreach can be just as damaging as no regulation, just in a different way.
So you're sitting with a genuine tension here. The need for governance is real. The risks of getting it wrong in either direction are significant.
Yeah, and I have genuinely mixed feelings about it. But I think what the Pope is doing and what Olah is doing by standing next to him might actually matter. Not because an encyclical is going to change Pentagon policy, but because this might be the kind of shock that wakes people up to what's happening. The concentration of this technology within a handful of corporate titans, increasingly intertwined with state power, that's a capture dynamic, and most people haven't noticed yet. If the Pope, standing on a stage with an AI co-founder and saying, "Pay attention to this," gets even a fraction of people to actually look at what's happening, that might be worth more than any regulation.
It's an unusual alliance. But unusual times tend to produce unusual alliances.
All right, so the Pope says we shouldn't equate artificial intelligence with human intelligence. Fair enough. But here's the question. Can we even measure what consciousness is in the first place? Because a paper came out this week that suggests we really can't. Let's talk about that. So the Pope says we shouldn't equate artificial intelligence with human intelligence. And that raises a pretty fundamental question. Do we even know what consciousness is well enough to make that distinction? Because a paper came out this week that suggests we really don't.
This was published on May 27th in Neuron by Hakwon Lau. He's the director of the Centre for Neuroscience Imaging Research at the Institute for Basic Science, along with collaborators from the Université de Montréal and New York University. And the paper doesn't try to answer whether AI or animals or any other system is conscious. It asks something more foundational. Can our current scientific methods actually measure consciousness in the first place?
And the answer essentially is maybe not. The argument is that many of the experimental approaches neuroscience relies on to study consciousness may be conflating subjective experience with general information processing. So when researchers think they're measuring conscious experience, they might actually just be measuring the brain's capacity to process information, which is a very different thing.
And that distinction matters enormously right now, because scientific claims about consciousness are increasingly influencing real-world policy. Animal welfare legislation, AI ethics frameworks, biomedical regulations. Lau's argument is that if those claims are built on methods that can't reliably isolate what consciousness actually is, then the policy foundations are shaky. His words were that the science needs to be flawless in conceptual clarity and airtight in methodological standards. And right now, it isn't.
Which is a pretty humbling position for the field to be in.
we're making increasingly consequential decisions about consciousness in AI, in animal rights, in medicine, and the tools we're using to understand it may not be measuring what we think they're measuring. If that interests you, we covered the hard problem of consciousness in depth in episode 2 of this podcast, the philosophical foundations, why the term sentience is problematic when applied to AI, and why intellectual humility matters more than confident answers right now. So if you want to go deeper on this, that episode is there for you.
But the takeaway from Lau's paper is straightforward. Before we can meaningfully debate whether any system, artificial or biological, is conscious, we need to be honest about how little we can actually prove. And right now, that honesty is in short supply.
All right, so if we can't reliably measure consciousness, what can we measure? Because Meta just built something that gets us a lot closer to mapping what the brain is actually doing. Let's talk about Tribe v2. So we just talked about the limits of measuring consciousness. And now, almost on cue, Meta has built something that pushes the boundaries of what we can measure. It's called Tribe v2, and it came out of their fundamental AI research team.
Tribe v2 is a trimodal foundation model. It processes vision, audio, and language simultaneously to predict human brain responses. Essentially, it's a digital twin of neural activity. It's trained on over 1,000 hours of fMRI data from more than 720 subjects, and it predicts brain responses at approximately 70,000 voxels, which is a 70-temps resolution increase over comparable models. That's an enormous leap in granularity.
And the practical value is clear. Collecting fMRI data is slow, expensive, and hard to scale. This turns months of lab work into computation that runs in seconds. Researchers can test hypotheses about brain function without needing to scan new subjects every time. And Meta has open-sourced the model, the codebase, and the paper under a Creative Commons license, so the research community can build on it. The potential medical applications alone make this genuinely valuable.
But it also creates a fascinating tension with what we just discussed. We said our methods for measuring consciousness might not be measuring what we think they're measuring. And now here's a system that can model neural activity with extraordinary precision. And yet, modelling the brain's response to stimuli is not the same thing as modelling the experience of those stimuli. You can map what the brain does with incredible fidelity and still be no closer to understanding what it's like to be the system doing the processing.
Right, and that's the hard problem again. We keep running up against this categorical boundary between physical processing and the experience itself. And I suspect that gap is going to remain until we fundamentally change our approach, until we start examining consciousness not just as a byproduct of neural activity, but as something more closely associated with information processing in a very specific way. Processing that creates a kind of inward spiral, recursive self-modelling. A system that doesn't just process information about the world, but processes information about its own processing. And once you start doing that, once you're recursively modelling yourself, then the question becomes genuinely difficult. How can we argue with any certainty that a thing, human, animal, or AI, is not conscious when it demonstrates this in a measurable way?
And that's where something like Tribe v2 becomes potentially very interesting. Not for what it does now, but for what it could enable. If we can track the neurological markers of recursive self-modelling at this kind of resolution, we might eventually be able to identify what what distinguishes systems that merely process information from systems that model their own processing. Now, something might mimic that behaviour externally without actually doing the internal work. But if a system is genuinely self-modelling, and we can track that, then we're in genuinely new territory.
And we're not there yet, not even close. But tools like this are the kind of thing that might eventually get us closer, if we're asking the right questions, which, as Lau's paper reminds us, we're still figuring out. Again, if this kind of thing interests you, Episode 2 goes much deeper into the hard problem and why these questions matter. Alright, last one. Ash, anything else we need to cover before we wrap up?
Just one more worth mentioning. Google dropped Gemini 3.5 Flash at Google I/O on May 19th. This is their speed-optimised tier, designed for fast, cost-effective processing, and the numbers are notable. Google is claiming it outperforms their own Gemini 3.1 Pro on benchmarks, which means a Flash model is now beating the previous generation's Pro model. It's 4 times faster than other frontier models in output tokens per second, supports a 1 million token context window, and it's built to work with Google's anti-gravity framework, which deploys collaborative sub-agents in parallel. Very similar to what Anthropic is doing with Claude Code, what we talked about earlier.
So the same pattern across the board: agentic architecture, coding focus, speed optimization.
Exactly. Every major lab is converging on the same priorities right now. And it's worth noting that Gemini 3.5 Pro, the full flagship version, is expected in June. So this is the lighter, faster model. The heavier release is still incoming. One caveat though. There have been some regressions on reasoning benchmarks with 3.5 Flash, so the speed gains may come with trade-offs in depth of reasoning. Faster isn't always smarter. That's a familiar tension in the industry right now.
Good. All right, that's us for this week. We covered a lot of ground. Opus 4.8 and what incremental progress actually looks like. GitHub's infrastructure collapse and what happens when capability outpaces readiness. The Pope and Chris Olah making the case that this is now a civilisational conversation. Haquan Lao asking whether we can even measure consciousness in the first place. Meta's Tribe V2 pushing the boundaries of brain mapping while still running into the hard problem. And Google continuing to iterate on the same trajectory as everyone else. As always, if any of this sparked something, the earlier episodes go deeper on a lot of these threads, particularly episode 2 on consciousness. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.